Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. And if you're new here, I post every Friday about growing cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and them indoors or outdoors or not at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week and am a complete amateur. These are my ramblings of trying to figure out what can grow for me. And this is a great case in point. Look at that amazing butter yellow flower. Before we go any further, it is Paphiopedilum Duo de Citron. 2 lemons perhaps could be the logical translation of that name, and not completely inappropriate because this is a sequentially blooming Paphiopedilum hybrid. So yes, today's video is all about this beauty, but I have actually made a video about this before. I bought it and it was in spike, and I had another Paph, this one here, that was in bloom, so I made a video. It was 2 years ago, and I was all, yeah, this is how you grow Paphs. Well, I have learned a few things in the years in between. Years, note that, plural. So let us get into the story of Duo de Citron and just how long it takes for it to rebloom. Okay, but before we go any further, a little bit of background about Paphiopedilum. So Paphiopedilum, as opposed to Phragmopedium, which is a different group of orchid, the Paphiopedilum comes from Southeast Asia. So basically, all of that peninsula, including Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, all the way down across into Indonesia, across the top of Australia, New Guinea, and over to some of the far western Pacific Islands. There are none that are native to Australia though. Basically all the way across the top. And as you can see, quite tropical countries. But some of the Paphs grow at quite high altitudes, relatively high, and some are described as cool to warm. Some Himalayan species are able to take much cooler temperatures, others are very tropical. So there's quite a big range of species within the group. But they all have this type of flower, which is commonly called the slipper orchid. And I have also made a collaborative video about growing slipper orchids, and I've made a few others, so I'll link all of those below so you can see what else I've been up to. But I think now, 2 years down the track, and it's 2 years since this was in bloom and 2 years since this one was in bloom, I think I now have the voice of experience to tell you what my journey has been. But I think the king of Paphiopedilum and Phragmopedilum orchid videos is Ed's Orchids, and I will link his below. He really is, I think, the guru and godfather of us all when it comes to Paphs and Phragmopedilums. So do go and have a look at his channel because he's got lots of brilliant videos about his method of growing them, and Ed is in Britain. Whereas I am in Melbourne in Australia, and our climate is a little different. So maybe we'll just also step back and just look at some basic care. A lot of Paphiopedilums, but not all, are terrestrial, and we'll get to the ancestors of this one in a minute, but some are also epiphytes and some are lithophytes. But the majority, I think it's fair to say, are terrestrial, which means they live on the floor, the forest floor, in lots of rich humus, but often near cliffs and rocks. So a little bit of limestone is often around them, which we'll get to in a minute. So that means it's kind of an understory plant, which means not a strong light loving orchid, but many of the things that you'll read about Paphs is low light, low light, low light. Well, you've kind of got to play that by ear. I moved Duo de Citron from a relatively low light area to a higher low light area, if that makes any sense. And if you watched my grow space video, which I'll link here, it's now living, this Paph is now living at the base of our stairs, which is a north facing light well. I'm in the southern hemisphere, so north facing means we get all of the strongest daylight. Obviously in the northern hemisphere it would be a southern window, would be the equivalent. So it gets quite deep penetrative light in winter because the sun is lower, although it's opaque glass, so it's not bright and doesn't burn the leaves. In summer the sun is higher, so I get a wash of beautiful light, but it's cooler down there and not bright for a huge amount of the day just because of the architecture of the space. So there is a chunk of the day where there's some good solid hours of bright indirect light, which perhaps goes against what you might read about Paphiopedilum. So I think a general rule of thumb is the more mottled the leaf, the lower light it needs, and the more monochrome the leaf, the more light it needs. But anyway, I don't know if that's particularly true. This one though is getting slightly more light than it did before, and look. But all right, let's get to this particular case in point, Paphiopedilum Duo de Citron, and I do love that name. It is very butter lemony, and it does have sequential flowers, not just two, but many. Anyway, let's look at its ancestor species, because I think if you can figure out where your orchid came from ancestrally, it will give you some clues about what it wants. So whether its ancestors were lithophytes, epiphytes, terrestrial, whether they're warm, hot, cool, etc. So the result of your DNA test is parent number 1, Paphiopedilum primulinum. Now that grows in Sumatra, which I'm here to tell you is a tropical island. It's relatively high altitude, but it is still described as a hot to warm grower. But the characteristic that that orchid has is that it is a successive bloomer, so one flower after another on the same spike. Not like Psychopsis orchids, which can last for years. These generally will only last a year, and you might get 4 or 5 blooms, and then the spike will die, you cut it off and it repeats. So it doesn't last for years and years and years, but it certainly lasts at least 6 months, and so you get amazing flowers. Anyway, so that parent gives us that successive flowering characteristic. And the result of your DNA test number 2 is your second parent is Paphiopedilum armeniacum. And that one is found in Yunnan province in southern China. So that is that magical botanical hotspot where all manner of things have grown. Magnolias, azaleas, orchids, all kind of amazing flowering trees and plants and shrubs have sort of evolved in that part of the world. So it's botanically amazingly rich, and one parent comes from there. And the characteristic of that one is the bright butter yellow. So combine the two, bright butter yellow, sequential blooming, ta-da! And that Chinese parent is considered warm to cool, so it's higher elevation and gets colder winter minimum temperatures. Put that all in a blender, and what does that mean in terms of care? So some Paphiopedilums, as I said, can take quite cool temperatures. Now in Melbourne here, our winter nighttime minimums outside rarely get below 2 degrees centigrade, about 36, 38 Fahrenheit, just above freezing. Sometimes we can dip quite close, but I'm in the inner city. Obviously, the further out you get, the colder the winter minimums can be, and you can drop below freezing. However, lots of people grow Paphiopedilums in Melbourne outside under cover, so they're protected, but nonetheless outside all year. However, with this one, I just felt in my heart instinctively that with that kind of Sumatran ancestry, I just didn't think this plant was going to love being outside. So I have never risked having it outside. I've kept it indoors all year. So it's in a cooler spot downstairs, as I mentioned, and that is one of the coolest spots of the house in winter. Although obviously the ambient temperature is warmer than outside, it's certainly cooler, and it's cooler in summer down there as well. So that's this path's journey. Now, some other basic care, which I've been through with all the others, is that so both ancestors are classic terrestrials. They both grow in sort of limestoney cliff areas. So one of the things to perhaps think about is if a plant grows in an area with limestone, it might love a little bit of garden lime in its mix. Just in a plant this size, not a lot, like half a fingernail full, just sprinkled once a year in spring. So that is what I'm going to do with my paths, with this path from now on, just a little bit of garden lime in spring, as you would top dress fertilizer. So what I use for terrestrial orchids is literally out of the bag potting mix, and I actually made a video about the sort of potting mixes I use, which I'll link. Literally, go to the hardware store, there's a bag that says orchid mix, and that's what I use for paths, and also Australian native orchids, many terrestrial orchids, and any kind of aroid household plant too. But what you could mix in that, your basic out of the bag mix, is some perlite as well, which just retains moisture and loosens it up a bit. But you want it to be free draining, but you don't want it to be drying out super quickly. So Paphiopedilums, the watering can be a bit tricky. So it's a terrestrial, it's not going to dry out completely. And as you can see, this type of plant has no pseudobulb. So it doesn't have the capacity to store huge amounts of water, which means you've got to stay on top of it, but erring on the side of too much and they will develop root rot. And I can show you what happens. So these plants were bought at the same time. This one has flowered for me, has a new growth, we'll get to that. This one never has, and this one I decided to experiment by growing it outside all year under cover to see how it went. It survived that first winter, it didn't really prosper. I thought, right, second winter I'll bring it inside, which we've just gone through. But about 6 months ago, I just kind of touched the plant and realized it was just sitting on the surface. It had no roots. Now, when I potted it, it did. So I took it out and sure enough, it had root rotted. Luckily, there was one root left. So I was able to repot it. I potted it smaller and we started again. Now it has produced a new leaf. So it clearly has roots. I can't see what its root system is, but it's alive and it's been 6 to 8 months. So I would say that operation has been successful, but just goes to show they were literally next to each other, getting exactly the same amount of watering conditions, and one developed root rot and one didn't. So you got to keep your eye on your paphs. And the roots are really quite thick and quite furry. They're unlike any other orchid root I've seen. The plants do like to be potted as small as possible, so the smallest vessel you can get to fit that root ball is the best way to go. So a good rule of thumb, I would say, is water it, allow it to dry out reasonably, but not completely, and then water it again. Now, I can't say what that is. It depends on your environment. It depends how warm your home is. Depends if you're growing them outdoors or indoors. Many variables. It also depends on the medium. Some people grow them in sphagnum moss that retains moisture in a different way that a bark-based mixture would. So you've got to kind of figure it out for yourself, but don't let the medium stay wringing wet. It needs to dry out quite a lot, sort of 80%, and then you water it again. Once you've found that rhythm for yourself, you'll kind of get it right, and just ease off in winter because, you know, it's cold and it's wet and they don't want to be cold and wet. What you don't want is water sitting in the saucer. So let it drain when you water it and then figure out when you need to water it again. So with me, I would say it's about once a week. If it's really warm, I might do it every 3 days, but that's kind of a rough ballpark. It's tricky and it is easy to make mistakes, as I discovered. Fertilizing wise, you know, pretty much like every other orchid, I give it a top dressing in spring and I give it a liquid fertilizer maybe once every 3 waterings in the warmer part of the year, spring, summer, early autumn. And that can either be an orchid specific liquid fertilizer or something like a tonic that's seaweed based, or worm juice, for example, diluted always down by at least 1/6, 1/8, 1/10, because I feel it's not a great idea to overfeed your plants. And then in winter, I don't feed them at all. I just really keep my eye on the watering to make sure I'm not over watering them in winter. And when I repot anything, I always put some slow release fertilizer into the mix. And that's what I top dress with in spring, slow release fertilizer. And get one that says 6 months. You can get them that release over 12 months, but you don't really want to be releasing fertilizer in the winter colder months. So a 6-month release, slow release fertilizer, I feel is the best bet, and literally just a few grains, not too many. So let us now get to the life cycle of our Paphiopedilum, because this, I think, plant lovers, is the crux of the issue with these things. Let me just tell you right now, they are slow to grow. So this one was in bloom just like this, basically 2 years ago. Now, my assumption at the time was, like many orchids, you would get a new growth a year and that new growth would bloom, like many orchids. Most oncidium types will do just that. Many orchids will do just that the new growth will appear in a 12-month cycle and it will bloom at the end of that 12-month cycle. Not so Mr. Paph. Mine, and it might be very different for the hybrids you have or just your experience, you might be better at it than me, which means you're covered in blooms. But all of these have followed a similar timeline. So this is the dead stump of the flower from 2 years ago. Then what occurs is, so once that flower has just about died down, a little nub appears at the crown, and then one of these sort of fans starts to appear again, and off it goes. It grows and you think, great, I'll have a bloom. This fan basically takes a year to mature and then another year, and it's in that 2nd year cycle, from my experience, that it will decide to bloom. So you're basically looking at a 2-year blooming cycle. Well, I am. I'd love to know if you have Duo de Citron and it blooms every year for you. I'd be curious to know. So that's a bit of a commitment for an orchid that blooms only once every 2 years. However, the payback for this one is that it's sequential. Each of these blooms lasts a good month, and I think last time I had 4. So that's kind of almost half the year that you've got this orchid in flower. So you do get bang for buck, so I think we can forgive it for that. But my experience has been really, really slow to grow and slow to flower. Plant lovers, I'm just going to drop this footage in because the second flower opened and I just couldn't resist showing you. I made the other video about this Paphiopedilum last week, and in that interim the second flower opened. I thought it would take a lot longer, but it didn't. And as the name is Duo de Citron, which means two lemons in French, it seems appropriate that we have two flowers. And you can still see the bud of the third just nestling in there, a sequential bloomer. Now, if we look at this one, this is a hybrid and it's a bit of a complex mix. It's Ruby Leopard. It's called Ruby Leopard and it's a mix of Black Jazz and Firefighter. Now this bloomed for me. I bought it as a seedling 3 years ago, I think. It bloomed the next year for me. I was so excited. I thought I've got this whole Paph thing down pat, and then nothing. What it did do though, and you can see kind of, and I'll show you more closely. So this is the fan at the front that bloomed first, and then this fan grew, and this is a year's worth of growth. So it's just matured for me. So I would say next year, this is going to bloom, and I holding it to the light, I can't see any flower bud in there at the moment, but I would imagine within the next 6 months that fan is ready to bloom. Look at the beautiful foliage on that. It's the most gorgeous mottled color. So you've got this plant for 2 years not doing a lot. Luckily the foliage is quite pretty. So this one is, I bought this in bloom 6 or so months ago, and some very kind viewers told me what it was. I have, of course, not written a label yet, and now I can't remember, but I can go back and look at your comments. But this one, as you can see here, has just begun its fan growth. So I cut the flower off maybe 2 months ago when it finished, and then the plant started to produce this new growth. So I'm imagining this growth is going to take a year to mature, and then the following year it will bloom. So that's about 18 months before it's going to start developing a bud. The bud then takes quite some time to develop into its spike and then into opening. So you're kind of looking at 2 years again. Anyway, that's the commitment with Paphiopedilum. So what might be a great idea if you're wanting to get a few is buy them successively. So buy one in bloom, and then the next year buy another one in bloom, and then you might always have one in bloom. That might be a better idea. Plant lovers, what a journey it's been learning about Paphiopedilum, and essentially you've just got to be patient. They will bloom as long as they're getting enough light but not too much light, and as long as you don't kill them with root rot by over watering them. Otherwise it's kind of a just sit there, leave it to do its business and wait for 2 years. So there we are, plant lovers. Paphiopedilum 101-2, because I made the first one when I thought I knew everything 2 years ago, and I didn't. Now I've kind of learnt the rhythm of mine, so we'll see. But I'm so happy this is bloomed. Look at that yellow, it's so juicy. You can already see the second bud is just starting to open, and there's a third bud in there, and there's a nib for a fourth. So I think I'm at least guaranteed 4 flowers. That's going to take me way into 2023. Goodness me, let's just hope we're all still here then. Anyway, plant lovers, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed our Duo de Citron touch base, because it's been an interesting observational period to learn how it grows. Anyway, I hope wherever you are, all is well in the world. Many thanks for watching. I do post every Friday, so do hit subscribe if you want to follow my continuing adventures. And I do post a short every Monday, which is just a short, because it's a short about something that I don't have enough to talk about for more than 60 seconds. So do have a look at those if you're interested. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.